This video I'm going to talk about muscle ups. We're going to go through some basic drills that you can do and also look at some reps and try and compare from person to person and seeing the differences, some good stuff and also some things that could be cleaned up a little bit. So I'm just going to start by playing video. I'm going to show first a basic drill. So on a low set of rings and practicing the movement pattern. So the skill of transitioning over the rings. So you're going to start pretty much parallel to the floor. So you'll start at the bottom. And the further back you go, so the further back you walk your feet, the easier it becomes. And I guess the more your shoulders are under the rings or your head are under the rings, the harder it's going to become. So the further out you walk your feet. Zach's in a pretty good position. Like, it still requires a fair bit of strength to pull up and over the rings. We're not practicing the dip because the dip's the easy bit. It's not, it can be, if that's the weakness, you practice dips on its own. This is the movement pattern, the skill, which you need to drill in over and over and over again. So when you go up to the high rings, it's just automatic. It's going to happen because you've practiced the movement pattern over and over again without that extra load. So it's sort of like practicing your snatches really light. So when you go heavy, you can just switch off and go. So it's the same concept. And we want to follow the line of the chest. Okay, so that first one, he pulled and let the rings go out a little bit early. That one was much better. So he pulled higher. We're to think about pulling to the sternum and then following the line of your chest and then ending up turning the rings so they are next to your body. So we start like this. He's got a false grip, but you can practice with a false grip. It shortens that range of motion and gets your hands over. But if you go on normal grip, you still want to get your hands as high over the top of the rings as possible. The higher, the better, because it's going to help with the transition. If you just hold the rings in your knuckles, you're going to really struggle to transition the elbows up and over the rings. So you need to get as high a grip on those rings as possible. So he's pulling to the sternum, the rings turn out, and then he transitions over the top of the rings. And this part here has to be fast, okay? Especially when we go on the high rings. If that's slow, you're just gonna drop down because your momentum of your hips brings you up when you do a real muscle up. And then that transition over needs to be fast before gravity pulls you back down. Okay, so speed is also important. So practicing that over and over again is important. And I like to do this as a bit of a warm-up as well. So sort of like a ring row position into a transition. And I'll do that like probably 10 times just to warm up the shoulders, to warm up the movement pattern. It's a really good drill, even if you're good at muscle ups, just to incorporate and make it a warm-up and to just drill that technique without having to think about it with that extra load on the high rings. So that's a good basic drill to practice the skill of the transition. And then we're going to go into doing some kipping swings. So on the high rings, doing kipping swings. So we're opening up at the back and just getting a feel for that pop at the front. Okay, so this one, you want to be like on that front swing, pushing down on the rings and keeping that hollow body position and letting the feet come up. So just getting a practice for that. My backswing here isn't great. That's the beauty of video, because when I watch it, like ideally, you do see a lot of people with a bent knee. It is sort of like a broken chain. Ideally, I'd like to see this a bit straighter or straight, the backswing. And I can tell I'm a little bit tight through my shoulders because they don't really want to open. I didn't really warm up before this, but practicing this where you open up and then pushing down on the rings so you come up nice and high in front and getting a feel for that as well, where you can generate that power from the backswing to get up this high on the front swing. Okay, so if you can't get up high, you're going to really struggle when we go to our hips to rings. So after you've practiced the kipping swing where you're generating power, so you need to snap from a arch position or hollow position really fast, and that generates the power. If you do it slowly, you're not going to generate any power. If you do it fast, you're going to generate a lot of power. This does look a little bit messy, but the idea behind this is to see whether you can actually extend your hips at the rings and actually make contact with the rings at the top. So as you go through, so your knees come up, see how my knees and feet are up high, and then I extend my hips and my feet come down. When I do a muscle up, it's not that extreme. So like I said, it looks a bit messy, it looks extreme, but what I'm practicing is getting my knees and feet up high and then getting that movement pattern of extending my hips. So I'm up and then extending my hips by squeezing my glutes, just like we would do a kettlebell swing or a glute bridge. I am in that broken hip position or flexed hip position, which is this one, where I go back that little bit there, and then a little bit further back, actually, like there. That's like the bottom of our glute bridge. And then at the top of the glute bridge, I am here, where I'm fully extended at the top and my hips are touching the rings. So that's another thing you can practice on its own, is your ability to go from like a hollow position or fully extended position and touch the rings at the top. And your feet are lower. Your feet don't need to be straight in front because your momentum then carries down. So as my feet come down, I'm going to transition over the top of the rings. But this is an extreme position. It's just practicing that, getting the hips up nice and high close to the rings. And then the next frame, we're going to start to see some actual muscle ups put together. So Mad's jumping up. She's creating that momentum for the back swing. So then come through on the front swing. She extends her hips and she's going to do 3 reps in a row. Just keep an eye on at what point she extends her hips. So she extends her hips there, which is a fair distance away from the bottom of the ring. So she's got to do a fair bit more effort of pulling herself up and over the top. She does have momentum going up, but if she could extend a little bit later, she'll end up higher. See how she's really low in that dip. Her hips are really low in relation to where the rings are. So that's going to make the dip a lot harder because of how much weight she's got underneath the rings and how low she's caught. So it's a really low dip. It's going to eventually be the breaking point in the muscle up is the dip because of the kipping swing. So let's see Zach, he's going to do 3 reps as well, creating a bit of momentum. He extends his hips a little bit higher. I'll slow it down at the point where he does hit full extension. So he hits full extension there. So it's a fair bit. Mads was probably like down here. Zach's is higher. And you can tell he's got that little bit more power in the hips too, where he's just going to be floating up and over the rings. So we'll see. He ends up transitioning much higher and then lets himself sort of drop down. So his hips are higher in relation to the rings. Mads' hips were down here, and he's in this like more of a tucked position, which is going to not have as much weight underneath the rings. Where if your legs are straight underneath the rings and your hips are really low, it makes it so much harder to do a dip. If you jump on the rings and just do some ring dips where you keep your hips high, or if you let your hips drop really low, they're much harder. So going for his last rep. He's got that back swing, lets his feet and knees come up, extends his hips. His feet are going down at that point because we want momentum of the feet going down because he's going to transition over. And then from there, he pulls his, so this is an important point. Let the momentum of the transition, so his feet go back, and as he goes to push out the dip, he's pulling his heels to his butt, which is utilizing that momentum of the transition to help with the dip. So that's what I like to do as well. And I'll show you at the end of this video, when you actually get stuck in the bottom, the best way to kip out of that. So there's 3 reps from Zach. We've got another 3 reps from Mads from a side view. So again, starting that momentum to get the backswing. Her knees come up. She extends her hips, pulls her ankles to her butt to try and help with the lockout of the dip. And another point here is when we look at her transition, look at how those rings are turned. It's a bit harder from this angle. Let's go back to this one. And look at where the rings are facing. Now let's go to Zach. Zach keeps the rings in much tighter, and they're facing more out to the sides rather than front on. So this is a stronger position in the bottom of the dip as well. Where if you've got let's watch him push out from that position. They do turn out and face us a little bit, but the bottom of the dip is more so what I was looking at. So let's look at Mads' transition again. See how we can see a lot more of the front. It's not like they're turned in. The elbows are flared out, which means the rings are facing us more at the bottom, which is like a weaker position of the shoulder. So being careful of that in that bottom position as well. Making sure those rings are in nice and tight to the body and our elbows are sort of back rather than flared out where the shoulder ends up being sort of internally rotated and you end up struggling more in the bottom of that dip. So we'll go back to this one. So it's not that bad. I'm like literally picking just that little bit, but I know as fatigue will come in, that will get worse and worse and the rings will face forward even more and more. So we need to think about transitioning properly so those rings are nice and tight to the body as another point to extending those hips nice and high so we end up over the top of the ring. So that one was pretty good. Actually, the full extension is there. So she's hits full extension at this point. And we'll see where Zach does. So the momentum gets her, as she extends, you can see her momentum's going up and then like stops at the point of the rings. Stops at the point of the rings, and at that point, upper body and momentum takes over to transition over the top. And then she pumps the heels to her butt to get out of that dip. Then we've got Jay next, actually. Creating a backswing. His feet come up and he extends his hips fully well, he's still extending. He's extended probably like there. So as you can see, that's where Mads' momentum pretty much stopped, where Jay hits extension. So he's got weightlessness in the transition. So he's weightless through this part because his momentum's still up and it hasn't gone down yet. It's starting to go down once his feet come down. Okay, so he's got over the top of the rings And you can see he's in a much higher position over the top of the rings, where when Mads was extending her hips late and much lower, at the point where she needed to transition, she's got all her body weight there through the transition, where Jay was weightless through the transition. And then he pushes out the dip. Let's watch again. So he's got a good backswing, brings the knees up, extends the hips nice and high. Again, transitioning with pretty much no body weight, using the momentum of his hips and the power from his hips to transition over the top. And it's a really fast head over, letting his feet come back through and seeing that tuck position. See how high his hips are in relation to the rings? They're literally just under his knuckles, where they're not down here. If they're down here, like he's literally just transitioned. Look how high his hips are. He's transitioned for the dip with his hips nearly at the bottom of the rings. Let's go back to Mads. Look how low her hips are in relation to the bottom of the rings if you compare her and Jay. And Jay's in like a tucked position here. So in this transition, he's like in a tucked position. So this dip is so much harder. She's got so much more body weight underneath the rings, where Jay's got all his body weight up there before he's even started the dip. Okay, so he's in this position at the bottom of the dip. So he's got a lot more. I guess, work done with just momentum and by extending up higher. So he's here in that tucked position at the bottom of the dip and then presses it out. Much easier. Like I said, try dips where you let your hips drop right down and then keep your hips high. They are so much easier. That's why in competition at regionals and stuff, we had to lower our hips as we descended in the dip, because it was a no rep if you kept your hips high and just sort of levered your upper body, because they're so much easier. Now this one, I'm just going to demonstrate if you get stuck at the bottom of a dip of the muscle up. So a lot of people kick down and try and press out, where that doesn't make sense, because when you kick down, you're sending force towards the ground. You want to send force towards the ceiling. So you actually want to pump your knees up. So pump your knees up and press. So at the bottom, my feet go back, and then as they come forward, I pump my knees up to lock out the dip. And on this next one, I even exaggerate more on this next one and hold the bottom for a few seconds. And this is what I'll do if I like literally just make the last rep. I'll just hang out in the bottom there, let my feet come forward like a swing, let it come back and let it come forward again, and pump the knees up. So I'm just sort of like winding it right up. Let them come forward, let them come back. So you can practice that on a low set of rings as well. Is just start at the bottom of the dip with your hips really low, because you've sort of just made it over the top, like that similar position Mads was in earlier. And then I'll let my feet go back, let them come forward and pump the knees up. So I've got literally the whole momentum of my legs. So I'll start back there, I transition over, my feet are going back, I'll wind them forward to create even more of a backswing on the next one, and then really drive my feet forward and my knees up to have some momentum to pull me up. So there's quite a few different styles of muscle ups and some different takeaways from that. I hope it helped you. If you've got any questions, just post into the comments and I'll answer them.